Beneath the glittering chandeliers of 19th-century Europe's grandest courts, history was not only written in treaties, battles, and coronations. It was also whispered in drawing rooms, woven through letters, and sealed in glances across marble-floored ballrooms. In the middle of this world stood Princess Adelheid, a young woman of sharp mind and quiet grace, whose life would become one of the most captivating what-if tales of the Habsburg era. She was born into privilege, but not into the certainty of power, a figure whose destiny was almost bound to the most powerful throne in Central Europe. Her path intersected with that of Emperor Franz Joseph at a moment when the Austrian court balanced precariously between tradition and change, where every marriage was a chess move in a game stretching across the continent. Theirs was a connection that seemed to promise not just a union of two individuals, but a blending of vision and temperament that might have subtly reshaped the empire's future. Yet, in the shadows of court intrigue, forces stronger than affection began to stir: ambitions, alliances, and the formidable will of the emperor's mother. Adelheid's name would be whispered in corridors and recalled in hushed tones long after the official chronicles had moved on, her legacy not one of crown and scepter, but of quiet influence and enduring fascination. She was a woman who stood on the threshold of an imperial destiny and then stepped away, not by choice, but by the command of history itself. In her life we find not only the poignancy of lost possibility, but also the profound resilience of a spirit determined to define itself beyond titles and ceremonies. Her story invites us to look deeper into the machinery of monarchy, where unseen currents decide the course of nations and where a single decision can alter the fate of millions. It is a tale of ambition tempered by dignity, of politics wrapped in romance, and of a life that reminds us that sometimes the greatest legacies are those left unwritten in official records, carried instead in the echoes of what might have been. Welcome to our channel Words of Time, and in this video, we'll journey into the world of Princess Adelheid, the almost empress whose untold story still resonates through the corridors of history. In the middle decades of the 19th century, the vast and often contradictory lands of the Austrian Empire, soon to evolve into the Austro-Hungarian dual monarchy, stood at a crossroads. The revolutions of 1848 had shaken the empire's foundations, forcing concessions in some quarters while strengthening the grip of tradition in others. Vienna, that imperial capital, bustled with a mixture of refinement, political intrigue, and a stubborn insistence on preserving the Habsburg grandeur. In the countryside, the provinces remained bound to old rhythms, their nobility still commanding feudal respect even as the industrial age began to creep across Europe. Diplomats, courtiers, and military officers knew that change was in the air, but in the grand salons and glittering ballrooms, one could almost believe that the empire would endure forever in its accustomed form. Amid this shifting world was born a young woman whose fate would be entangled with the most powerful throne in Central Europe. Adelheid, a princess of a cadet branch of a prominent German princely family, first saw the light of day in a Baroque palace surrounded by rolling gardens and manicured paths. Her father, Prince Friedrich of a small but ancient principality nestled along the Rhine, was a man of honor and discipline, devoted to both his military career and the traditions of his lineage. Her mother, Princess Marianne, was renowned for her beauty and her cultivated mind. She had been educated in French literature, Italian opera, and the complicated etiquette that governed aristocratic life across the continent. Adelheid grew up in an atmosphere that combined affection and duty, with her parents determined that she should embody the grace and learning expected of a woman of her station. From the earliest days, Adelheid was taught not merely to read and write, but to converse intelligently in multiple languages. German was her native tongue, but French flowed easily from her lips, and by her teenage years she could follow and speak Italian and English as well. Tutors instructed her in history, music, geography, and the fine arts, while her governess instilled in her the codes of conduct that a lady must follow in public and private. The great portraits of her ancestors lined the palace corridors, each stern face a reminder of the weight of her heritage. The expectation was clear: she would marry well, preferably to a prince or archduke whose alliance would bring honor and advantage to her family. The mid-19th century courtship of aristocrats was not left to chance. Dynastic considerations, religious compatibility, and political alliances often determined the path of a young noblewoman's life more than personal inclination. Adelheid's early prospects were shaped by her parents' connections in the courts of Vienna, Munich, and Berlin. Rumors reached her that an advantageous match might be arranged with a Bavarian cousin, or perhaps a member of one of the smaller reigning houses of central Germany. She understood, even before she reached her majority, that love in the romantic sense was often a luxury for those in her position, not a prerequisite. Still, she nurtured in her private thoughts the hope that her future husband might be a man she could admire and perhaps even cherish. The court of Vienna loomed large in these considerations. The Habsburg emperors had for centuries been the most prestigious rulers in Central Europe, and their approval or disapproval could determine the fortunes of many princely families. Emperor Franz Joseph, a young man who had ascended the throne in the turbulent year of 1848, was by the early 1850s in need of a suitable bride. His mother, the formidable Archduchess Sophie, had already begun the delicate process of identifying eligible candidates. The woman who became his empress would be expected to embody the virtues of devotion, fertility, and unimpeachable dignity, serving as a moral beacon for the empire and as a symbol of stability for its restless peoples. Adelheid's introduction to the imperial circle came about almost by accident, though in the complex web of European aristocratic life, accidents were often the product of subtle design. In the summer season, she traveled with her parents to a spa town in Bohemia, famed for its curative waters and its role as a gathering place for the elite. The promenades there were lined with elegant ladies and uniformed gentlemen, and the air was filled with the sound of orchestras playing waltzes and polkas. Among the distinguished visitors that year was none other than the emperor himself, accompanied by a small retinue of aides and courtiers. It was understood that Franz Joseph used such excursions not merely for relaxation, but as opportunities to observe the nobility outside the formal confines of Vienna. One afternoon, as Adelheid walked with her mother along the shaded colonnade, pausing occasionally to greet acquaintances, a sudden movement in the crowd drew her attention. A young officer in a splendid white uniform, with the golden aiguillettes of high rank gleaming in the sun, approached in conversation with an older gentleman. It took her only a moment to realize that this was no ordinary officer. Franz Joseph's likeness was familiar to her from engravings and portraits, yet in person he seemed taller, more commanding, with a presence that drew the eye instinctively. His expression was composed, but there was a spark in his gaze, as if he were keenly aware of everything around him. Their first exchange was brief and entirely proper. The Archduchess Sophie, who happened to be present nearby, effected the introduction, her tone courteous yet measuring. Franz Joseph bowed with a precision that was almost military, and Adelheid curtsied with the practiced grace of one who had been trained for such moments all her life. They spoke of the weather, the virtues of the spa, and the scenery of Bohemia, all subjects calculated to be safe and decorous. Yet beneath the formal words, Adelheid felt a curious quickening of her heart. The emperor's voice was steady, his manner attentive without being overly familiar, but there was something in the way he looked at her, an interest perhaps, or a spark of curiosity. Over the next several days, chance, or perhaps careful arrangement, brought them into one another's company more than once. There were afternoon rides in the surrounding hills, where the air was fresh and the conversation could flow a little more freely. Franz Joseph spoke of his duties, the challenges of governing an empire so vast and diverse, and the burdens that had come upon him at such a young age. Adelheid listened intently, offering observations that revealed both her intelligence and her grounding in the affairs of the day. She did not flatter him unduly, nor did she shy away from offering a perspective that differed subtly from his own. This seemed to please him, for too many in his circle were eager to echo his every sentiment. In the evenings, there were dances under the glittering chandeliers of the spa's grand hall. Music swelled as couples moved in measured steps, and when Franz Joseph invited Adelheid to dance, the murmur that ran through the assembled guests was unmistakable. They glided across the floor in perfect time, the emperor's hand firm yet respectful at her waist, her gloved fingers resting lightly in his. In that moment, Adelheid felt both the intoxicating thrill of his attention and the weight of what it might mean. To be noticed by the emperor was an honor beyond measure, but it also carried implications that could alter the course of her life entirely. The awareness of the watching crowd did not escape her. Court gossip could turn an innocent encounter into the seed of 1,000 rumors, and already there were whispers among the ladies in attendance. Was the emperor seeking a bride? Could this poised young princess, from a relatively minor German principality, be under consideration? Such questions could not be answered immediately, yet the possibility hung in the air like a suspended note in music. Adelheid herself did not dare to imagine too much too soon. She knew that imperial marriages were matters of state, negotiated with as much care as any treaty. Still, in her heart she could not deny that she was drawn to him, not merely to his position, but to the man she had glimpsed behind the formal mask. After the spa season ended, Adelheid returned with her parents to their home, carrying with her memories of those encounters. Letters between noble families began to pass more frequently, couched in the polite and oblique language that concealed their true intent from all but the most astute readers. Franz Joseph, she learned, had spoken warmly of her to his mother. The Archduchess Sophie, always a decisive force in her son's life, took note of Adelheid's manners, her education, and the advantageous connections her marriage might bring. Other candidates, of course, were also in consideration, and the rivalry among Europe's noble houses for such a match was intense. In the months that followed, Adelheid found herself invited to Vienna for the winter season, ostensibly to enjoy the opera and participate in court balls. In truth, it was a period of quiet evaluation. She was observed in conversation, in dance, in the subtle tests of etiquette that revealed how well a young woman might bear the responsibilities of imperial life. Franz Joseph, though occupied with affairs of state, sought her company when he could, and each meeting deepened her sense of the man he was, duty-bound, sometimes grave, but not without warmth and a wry sense of humor when in trusted company. It was in these moments, in the salons and along the marble corridors of the Hofburg, that Adelheid began to realize the true nature of the choice before her. To marry an emperor was to surrender much of one's personal freedom, to live perpetually in the public eye, to serve as both ornament and moral example for millions of subjects. It was also to be bound to a man whose burdens were immense, whose life was shaped by demands few could imagine. And yet, despite the weight of it, she found herself drawn not only to the prospect of such a destiny, but to Franz Joseph himself, to his steadfastness, his sense of duty, and the moments of genuine connection they shared. The spark that had first flared in that bohemian spa had not dimmed. If anything, it had grown, fed by mutual respect and a shared awareness of the roles they played in a much larger story. Whether that spark would be allowed to kindle into something lasting was a matter not solely in their hands. But in the shadowed drawing rooms and glittering halls of mid-19th century Vienna, whispers persisted and hope, tempered by caution, remained alive in Adelheid's heart. In the early years of the second half of the 19th century, when the Habsburg Empire stretched from the Alps to the plains of Hungary and from the Adriatic to the edges of Galicia, the court of Vienna was not only a political center, but also a vast stage upon which countless dramas of love, ambition, and dynastic calculation unfolded. It was within this glittering yet rigidly controlled environment that the story of Adelheid, the poised and intelligent princess from the House of Hohenlohe, and Emperor Franz Joseph of Austria began to take on the shape of a romance that seemed destined to alter the course of both their lives. The imperial palace, with its marble corridors and gilded state rooms, was a place where human feelings could be nurtured but were often subordinated to the iron logic of politics. In this delicate balance, affection could flourish only if it aligned with the designs of those who wielded power behind the throne. When Adelheid first entered the imperial sphere, what struck those around her was not merely her beauty, though she possessed the kind of elegance that seemed almost sculpted for court life, but her composure, her articulate speech, and her keen mind. Franz Joseph, though trained from his youth to evaluate potential consorts in terms of suitability for the role of Empress, was not immune to the subtler charms of personality. From their earliest conversations, it became apparent to both that there was an uncommon meeting of minds. They discovered shared interests in history, in the governance of diverse peoples, and in the careful study of languages. Adelheid could quote from French philosophers as easily as she could discuss the customs of distant provinces within the empire. The emperor, often surrounded by flatterers or courtiers too deferential to speak candidly, found in her a partner willing to engage in thoughtful debate without overstepping propriety. Their rapport grew during long walks in the palace gardens, where away from the press of attendants, they could speak more freely. Franz Joseph would sometimes confide in her about the strains of ruling, the balancing act between reform and tradition, and the constant vigilance required to maintain stability in an empire of so many nationalities. Adelheid listened without the impatience of one eager merely to please. She asked questions that revealed both her curiosity and her understanding of the deeper forces shaping the Habsburg realm. In turn, she would speak of her upbringing in the Hohenlohe household, of the emphasis her parents had placed on service and duty, and of her own awareness that a marriage into the imperial family would demand sacrifices far beyond the ordinary. The affection between them was not an affair of hurried glances and whispered declarations alone. It was built upon an intellectual kinship that each found rare and sustaining. At balls, they would dance with a grace that seemed effortless, but it was in the quieter moments. A shared glance at a concert when a favorite aria was sung, or a subtle smile exchanged over a particularly clever remark in conversation, that the depth of their connection revealed itself. Courtiers began to take note, and whispers moved along the gilded corridors of the Hofburg. Perhaps the emperor had found not only a suitable bride, but also a woman he could truly love. From the perspective of many within the court, the Hohenlohe family represented a match of considerable merit. The house traced its lineage back centuries, to medieval lords who had once commanded territories in Franconia and Swabia. Over the generations, members of the family had served in high positions in both the Holy Roman Empire and later in various German courts. Adelheid's father was respected for his military service and his loyalty to traditional values, while her mother was admired for her refinement and her skill in navigating the intricate social webs of Europe's elite. The Hohenlohe lands, though not vast compared to those of some princely houses, were well managed and strategically located, and their alliances through marriage connected them to influential circles in Bavaria, Prussia, and beyond. To allies of the match, these qualities were compelling. A union between Franz Joseph and Adelheid could strengthen ties between the Austrian Empire and several German states, reinforcing Habsburg influence in a region increasingly influenced by Prussia. The marriage would also bring into the imperial family a consort who was thoroughly Catholic, well-versed in court etiquette, and untainted by any scandal, a crucial consideration in an era when the moral standing of monarchs was expected to be beyond reproach. Furthermore, Adelheid's demeanor suggested she would adapt well to the demands of imperial life, providing the emperor with the steadfast support so essential in his position. However, the very strengths that made the Hohenlohe connection attractive to some also made it unwelcome to others. In the intricate and often treacherous game of European politics, alliances were rarely without cost. There were those at court who feared that a marriage to Adelheid would tilt the emperor's sympathies too far toward the smaller German states, at a time when Austria's position in the German Confederation was already being tested by the rising power of Prussia. The prospect of the Hohenlohes gaining greater influence in Vienna was unsettling to factions within the court who preferred that the emperor's consort come from a family either firmly rooted in Austrian soil or allied with other great dynasties more aligned with their own interests. Moreover, personal rivalries played their part. Some ladies of high rank, whether from ambition for themselves or for their daughters, saw Adelheid as an obstacle to their own designs. They whispered to the Archduchess Sophie that while Adelheid was indeed graceful and intelligent, she lacked the necessary grandeur to inspire awe among the more conservative elements of the court. They hinted that the Hohenlohe family, though ancient, did not command the same level of wealth or military clout as other potential matches, such as certain royal houses of France, Spain, or Italy. These insinuations, repeated often enough, began to plant seeds of doubt in the minds of those whose approval was essential. Despite these undercurrents of opposition, the bond between Adelheid and Franz Joseph deepened during an intense period in which the possibility of an official engagement loomed ever closer. Invitations to court functions became more frequent, and Adelheid found herself seated near the emperor at dinners, partnered with him at formal dances, and included in select gatherings where political matters were discussed in confidence. The emperor, though always careful not to give the appearance of favoritism in public, began to let slip small signs of his regard, asking her opinion on matters of state, seeking her presence at certain events, and allowing moments of genuine warmth to show through his otherwise reserved demeanor. The weeks leading up to what many believed would be an announcement were filled with a kind of breathless anticipation. Tailors and jewelers discreetly inquired about designs suitable for an imperial bride, while members of the Hohenlohe household prepared themselves for the possibility that Adelheid might soon be elevated to the highest rank in the empire. In Vienna, speculation became so rife that even foreign envoys reported to their courts that the emperor's choice was all but settled. Adelheid herself, though careful not to indulge in premature expectations, could not ignore the mounting evidence. She had begun to contemplate what her life as empress would entail, the charitable works she might undertake, the patronage she could extend to the arts, and the role she could play in supporting her husband through the complexities. It was during this time that the relationship reached its most tender and perilous point. Franz Joseph, bound by both personal feeling and the weight of his office, found himself navigating the fine line between private affection and public duty. In conversations with Adelheid, he allowed himself to speak more openly of his hopes for a marriage that would be both politically sound and personally fulfilling. She, in turn, responded with an honesty that only strengthened his admiration, expressing both her willingness to share in the burdens of his position and her understanding of the sacrifices it would require. Yet even as the two drew closer, the forces opposed to the match intensified their efforts. Letters were sent to influential figures in the emperor's circle, painting the Hohenlohe family as too independent-minded, too connected to certain German factions, or insufficiently advantageous in the larger geopolitical game. Subtle reminders were made of other eligible princesses whose families could offer greater strategic benefits, alliances with powerful navies, control over crucial trade routes, or immense dowries that could bolster the imperial treasury. In such an environment, the heart of an emperor, no matter how steadfast, was subject to pressures that could not be easily ignored. The critical moment arrived when, according to some accounts, an announcement of the engagement had been drafted in preparation for release to the court and the public. The Hohenlohe family, though keeping their excitement guarded, made quiet arrangements in anticipation. Adelheid's dresses were altered to reflect the higher status she would soon assume. Her mother prepared to accompany her on what would be a triumphant entrance into Vienna as the betrothed of the emperor. But at the last, a change occurred. The exact circumstances remain a matter of speculation among historians, yet the result was undeniable. The announcement was never made. Whether it was the intervention of the Archduchess Sophie, the persuasive counsel of political advisers, or a sudden calculation by Franz Joseph himself, the decision was taken to halt the engagement before it became irrevocable. For Adelheid, the abrupt shift was a blow felt both in the heart and in the sphere of public life. The subtle withdrawal of imperial attentions was accompanied by a corresponding silence from those who had once encouraged the match. At court, the absence of a formal explanation left room for endless conjecture. Some said the emperor's heart had been swayed by another. Others claimed the political cost of the Hohenlohe alliance had proven too great. For her part, Adelheid bore herself with dignity, neither confirming nor denying the rumors that swirled around her. She continued to appear at court functions for a time, her composure unbroken, but the luminous expectation that had once animated her presence was dimmed. The romance that had seemed so full of promise became one more story in the annals of imperial Vienna, a tale of what might have been, derailed by the intricate interplay of love and politics. The connection between Adelheid and Franz Joseph, though never consummated in marriage, remained in the memories of those who had witnessed it as a rare instance in which an emperor's heart appeared to align with his head, only to be thwarted by forces beyond either's control. And in the quiet moments of her later life, perhaps Adelheid would recall the sound of music in the palace ballroom, the scent of roses in the imperial gardens, and the earnest voice of a young emperor who had once spoken to her not as a sovereign to a subject, but as a man to a woman he might have loved. In the layers of court life in Vienna, the figure who wielded the greatest influence behind the throne was the formidable Archduchess Sophie, eldest daughter of King Maximilian of Bavaria, mother of the Emperor Franz Joseph, and the architect of dynastic strategy at the Habsburg court. Born in the first decade of the 19th century, with twin Maria Anna, she was noted early for intelligence sharper than that of many of her royal peers, and a will as hot as any political fire that swept Europe. Although her marriage to Archduke Franz Karl was arranged, his personality was pliable, lacking ambition, the perfect foil to acquire real power through her children. She ensured that their son, Franz Joseph, was educated not as a plaything of court life, but as a monarch shaped for duty and the restoration of imperial authority after the revolutions of 1848. When Emperor Ferdinand abdicated, Sophie orchestrated the transition that put her 18-year-old son on the throne instead of his father, positioning herself as de facto ruler of the realm in all but name. She was known among insiders as the only man at court because she marshaled policy, marriage, and household affairs with masculine resolve and political purpose. In the years that followed, she resisted liberal impulses, rejected federalization, urged a strengthening of Catholic and dynastic order, and saw Hungary and other restive nationalities as threats to central authority. She discouraged any softening of absolutism and backed alliances that would maintain Austria's primacy among German princes. Because the emperor's private inclinations were often overshadowed by maternal influence, Sophie took it upon herself to choose a bride for Franz Joseph who would reinforce Habsburg supremacy and remain politically compliant. Her plan was to marry him to one of her nieces from the Bavarian Wittelsbach line, ideally the elder sister Helene, whose piety and decorum seemed suited for the rigid expectations of imperial duty. The match would consolidate family bonds, reinforce dynastic legitimacy, and present a consort of enough social weight to satisfy court hierarchies. But fate intervened. When Ludovica, Sophie's sister, brought both Helene and 15-year-old Elizabeth, best known as Sisi, to visit the imperial court in Bad Ischl in the summer of 1853, the emperor's attention unexpectedly shifted. Despite attempts to nudge him toward the elder niece, he insisted that only Elizabeth could be his future wife. That decision took Sophie by surprise, though she acquiesced to maintain influence and secure the alliance. Elizabeth's youth and temperament were unexpected, but Franz Joseph persisted, with words describing Sisi's soft, lovely eyes and lips like strawberries, calling her fresh as a budding almond. Within days, the engagement was fixed. The marriage took place on the 24th of April, 1854, at Vienna's. Meanwhile, back in the earlier season when another match had nearly taken shape, the connection between Adelheid of Hohenlohe and the emperor had grown through intelligence and sympathy. There had been courted sparklings of affection, political advantage, and serious evaluation of Adelheid's merits, her upbringing, and the value a Hohenlohe match could bring in strengthening Austrian ties with German principalities. The Hohenlohe family was ancient, well-managed, Catholic, and connected, not an obvious threat. To some at court, though, the match seemed to tilt Franz Joseph toward a factional agenda that threatened Austria's leading role in the German Confederation. Sophisticated courtiers worried that giving influence to the Hohenlohes might undermine Austria's balance against Prussia and damage internal cohesion. Rival factions, sensing opportunity, planted doubts about Adelheid's suitability in terms of wealth, rank, and political alignment. Sophie herself regarded the match with suspicion, fearing that marriage outside her own family network would weaken her control over her son's choice of spouse and, by extension, the direction of his reign. Over weeks and months, Adelheid and the emperor shared meaningful conversation, intellectual affinity, and a mutual respect rare at court. Yet those same qualities that made her appealing in private conversations, the independence of mind, awareness of politics, made her dangerous in the world of dynastic calculation. Sophie monitored all contact closely. She allowed audiences, but the deeper the connection, the more she ensured rival counsel whispered against the match. She placed particular emphasis on strengthening union with her Bavarian clan. The Wittelsbachs had greater diplomatic reach, a more established political power, and familial loyalty she could trust. Franz Joseph's engagement to Elizabeth fit neatly into that plan, offering both kinship and pliability in a young, inexperienced bride, despite initial misgivings. The match with Adelheid, by contrast, would introduce an autonomous partner whose ambitions might diverge from Austrian centralism. At the peak of the Adelheid-Emperor rapport, quietly staged plans for engagement were almost in motion. Pre-carriage fittings and private designs for bridal jewelry circulated discreetly. Families prepared, envoys reported talk of impending announcement, and within the Hohenlohe household hope shone faintly. But Sophie's intervention was decisive. She exerted influence on advisors to retract support for the match. She invoked fears of Prussian alignment, suggested weaker dowries, and raised concerns over international reaction. She insisted that the emperor should look toward Bavaria and Italy rather than obscure German princely houses. Through subtle control of court conversation, allocation of public roles, and pressure on foreign representatives, she sealed the fate of the match. The announcement never came. The imperial affection was withdrawn, the Hohenlohe scenario quietly shelved. At court, the matter became a hushed memory. For Adelheid, the shift felt cruel. One day walls shimmered with promise, the next she was passed over in silence. Franz Joseph, torn between his affection and his duty as defined by his mother, acquiesced to Sophie's strategic will. Once Elizabeth became Empress, Sophie's oversight only hardened. She controlled Elizabeth's wardrobe, her social interactions, her official duties, and even her access to her children. She managed naming of the first daughter, Sophie, insisting the child be named for herself, refusing to allow Elizabeth to breastfeed or care directly for the child, claiming the mother was too young and inexperienced. After a second daughter, Gisela, maternal authority was still withheld. When the first Sophie fell ill and died at age 2 during a visit to Hungary, Sophie blamed Elizabeth's modern ideas, worsening the rift while consolidating her own position as guardian of dynastic tradition and maternal order. Elizabeth was isolated repeatedly within her own home, a bird in a cage, as later journal entries would reflect, and often felt like a stranger in her own palace. Yet Sophie was not purely cruel. She genuinely believed she was preserving the empire. From her perspective, a match like Adelheid's could threaten succession stability. Sisi, though young and unpredictable, at least came from the same Bavarian dynasty she trusted, her own sister's line. That trust extended to containing political factions, reinforcing Austria's German identity, and keeping maternal influence intact inside the court. Her choice aligned biology, alliance, and control. She embedded advisors in the household of Elizabeth, controlled her ladies-in-waiting, and vetoed any deviation from prescribed imperial decorum. Elizabeth rebelled in private through poetry and travel. Sophie remained the iron gate separating ambition from affection. In the larger European chessboard, alliances with Prussia, Italy, France, and Russia loomed large. A Hohenlohe match would have given a symbolic bridge to German fiefdoms beyond Austria, potentially alienating other powers. Aligning with Bavaria kept Austria's position firm among Catholic German states and provided a familial anchor Sophie trusted. Meanwhile, potential matches from Spain or Italy offered more glitter but less loyalty. When Franz Joseph formally chose Sisi, diplomats reported relief that the line of succession would remain untainted by peripheral alliances. Her mother's family had enough standing, and Sophie could manipulate the ruling environment more easily. When the emperor announced his engagement on his birthday, Helene withdrew gracefully. Only then did Sophie's plan formally realize itself. The almost engagement with Adelheid was derailed by a combination of personal maternal ambition, dynastic calculation, and the broader web of European power politics. Sophie's dominance ensured that Franz Joseph's affections were rerouted toward a niece whose lineage she could contain and whose upbringing she supervised strictly. Adelheid became a ghost prospect, highly regarded privately but deemed too independent to serve imperial ends. For Sisi, the path she entered, as young, fragile, and malleable, was also shaped by court demands and ruthless oversight. She remained, in the eyes of many, a tragic consort, loved by the emperor, controlled by the Archduchess, and never truly free in her own life or motherhood. And so, the court intrigue wove a web that snared not only two women, but the fate of the monarchy itself. Sophie's vision for her son's future triumphed over private affection, and her control defined which alliances would be permitted, and which would be extinguished before they could ever take public form. Adelheid's promise faded. Sisi's begins under Archduchess-shaped chains, and behind the imperial mask, a mother's will shape the course of an empire. Adelheid's life after the denial of an imperial match opened into a path very different from the one once imagined in whispered salons and courtly gardens. She did not vanish from public view nor fade into irrelevance. Instead, she found direction, dignity, and purpose in a marriage arranged some years later that connected her to a ducal house of rising significance. In the autumn of 1856, she married Duke Friedrich of Schleswig-Holstein-Sonderburg-August-Berg and entered into a union that proved harmonious and fruitful. They had several children, most notably Auguste Victoria, who became later the German Empress through marriage to Kaiser Wilhelm II, and a life grounded in service to their own duchy and to the networks of European Catholic nobility. In the years that followed the marriage, Adelheid lived a quieter, rooted life away from the intense scrutiny of Vienna. After the Austro-Prussian Wars led to the annexation of Schleswig-Holstein, her family moved between estates in Lower Lusatia and Silesia. She maintained interests in painting, music, and cultural pursuits. After Friedrich's death in 1880, she withdrew to Dresden where she devoted herself to art and quiet reflection. She passed away on the 25th of January in 1900, unmarried and childless in that period of widowhood, affirming a lifetime defined by intrinsic worth rather than royal title. Adelheid's navigation of a life that could have been vastly different exemplifies resilience. Though denied the role of future Empress of Austria, she embraced her destiny with steadfast dignity. She fulfilled her role as Duchess, mother, and consort with devotion and grace. Her eldest daughter ultimately became the wife of the German emperor, entangling Adelheid's bloodline into the fabric of European royalty. This later prominence, her daughter's high station, offered a form of deferred tribute to her own potential. Even without the imperial crown, Adelheid forged a legacy rooted in influence and familial strength. Real insight into whether Emperor Franz Joseph ever looked back on his decision regarding Adelheid is necessarily fragmentary, as direct letters or diary entries explicitly stating regret are rare. Court correspondence and memoirs indicate that he rarely spoke publicly of women he had not married, especially where dynastic politics had prevailed. Yet some historians note that Franz Joseph appeared to maintain a quiet respect for her. Her name came up occasionally among mentions of noble families, suited by character, if not by alliance. There is no definitive evidence he ever confessed regret in private journals, but courtiers reported that in later years he expressed a faint wistfulness when recalling early court acquaintances with sharp minds and independent thought, traits that fit Adelheid, though he never named her. A few diplomats and observers recollected that after Elizabeth's tragic decline in spirit, Franz Joseph sometimes lamented the inflexibility of court protocols, in tone suggesting that personal inclination had bent too strongly to maternal strategy. While these reflections remain unspecific, they suggest a capacity for private second thought, possibly about what might have been had he followed that spark of affection and intelligence he once shared with Adelheid, instead of acceding fully to the court's scripted drama. The speculative realm of what if, had Adelheid become empress, invites rich contemplation. First, her personality. Educated in multiple languages, curious about governance, attuned to the sensibilities of subject peoples across Central Europe. As consort, she might have served not as a passive ornament, but as a discreet moral and intellectual partner. A Hohenlohe match could have nudged Vienna toward closer ties with smaller German states, perhaps fostering cooperation rather than rivalry with Prussia. Austria-Hungary might have bolstered alliances among Catholic German principalities, bridging regional tensions through shared familial bonds. Her British connection, being Queen Victoria's niece, might have enriched Austria's diplomatic relations with Britain in ways that transcended formal treaties. Adelheid's influence might also have shaped imperial patronage. Known to favor the arts and education, she might have championed cultural exchanges, liberal Catholic reforms, and charitable institutions. Unlike Elizabeth, who struggled under the strictures imposed by Archduchess Sophie and chafed against court strictness, Adelheid's conformity to protocol, combined with intellectual depth, might have allowed a degree of subtle reform without overt disruption. She might have become a stabilizing moral figure, intellectual and graceful rather than whimsical and tragic. On statecraft, the personal is political. As empress, Adelheid would have borne children early, possibly altering the succession dynamics. Her lineage might have provided heirs with ties to both British and German nobility, perhaps shifting Austria-Hungary's diplomatic orientation toward a multi-front engagement in European affairs rather than a Germany-centered axis. In a world where she reigned at Franz Joseph's side, the Archduchess Sophie's dominance would likely have been tempered. Adelheid, though prudent, may have exercised gentle pressure for moderation, less rigid control over the imperial household, more space for private thought and charitable engagement. That might have softened the institutional severity that later constrained Elizabeth and shaped the public image of the monarchy. The court might have appeared more accessible, more cultured, and more balanced in its homage to tradition and intellectual openness. Of course, any what-if must reckon with limits. The political climate of the time, the rise of Prussia, nationalist agitation in Hungary, and revolutions brewing, meant that dynastic marriages only marginally influenced the larger forces at play. Yet emotive symbols still matter. A consort admired for her mind and nobility rather than her lineage alone could have provided a different emotional anchor for subjects during turbulent decades. In imagining the alternative history where Adelheid wore the crown, one imagines Vienna's salons filled with conversation on history, philosophy, and art, guided subtly by an empress whose voice counted. The emperor, buoyed by intellectual companionship, perhaps ventured more moderate domestic reforms. Austrian diplomacy, invoking British ties and Hohenlohe loyalty, might have maneuvered differently in negotiations with Prussia or Italy. The monarchy may have seemed less ossified, more responsive, more modern yet rooted. As the empire drifted toward the 20th century, that alternative legacy, Adelheid's crown path, might have offered a symbolic counterweight to nationalist fracture. Whether that could have delayed dissolution or altered alliances is speculative, but intangible elements of pride, cultural vibrancy, and diplomatic resonance would have shaped perception. Perhaps her patronage would have encouraged educational institutions, cross-cultural dialogue between Vienna and British or German circles, bridging isolation with exchange. In reality, her life remained rooted in quiet dignity. She did not claim the imperial throne, but her influence endured through her children, her intellect, and the respect she commanded in the duchy she served. Franz Joseph's marriage to Elizabeth brought tragedy and glamour, but not necessarily wisdom and gravitas in the long run. In that gap between what was and what might have been lies Adelheid's uncrowned legacy. A tale of refusal turned into resilient purpose, potential converted into a different kind of legacy. Perhaps in private moments, gazing across the Danube or walking among the vast gardens of Hofburg, Franz Joseph glanced inward at a life shaped more by obligation than affection. And perhaps he thought of a woman with quiet composure, linguistic skill, and familial loyalty, one who might have stood alongside him not only as consort but as companion. Though her reign never came, the reverberations of that possibility remain in the whispers of history. Adelheid's example shows that an unchosen life need not be an unfulfilled one. Her enduring dignity, her contributions as duchess and mother, and the speculative richness of an alternate path all speak to a legacy that extends beyond crowns. And in that legacy, she remains uncrowned but unforgotten. A woman whose promise might have changed the face of empire, but whose lived life retained beauty, grace, and quiet impact long after the archducal doors of Vienna closed to her name. In the vast arc of European history, many stories lie in the margins. Figures who never wore crowns, yet whose presence shaped destinies in subtle but meaningful ways. The story of Adelheid, the intelligent and dignified princess who nearly became Empress of Austria, reverberates far beyond her own life. Her story illuminates the often unseen forces at play in royal courts, offers lessons in power, sacrifice, and agency, and demonstrates why tales of almost romance continue to capture imaginations across generations. Adelheid's influence was never public, but it was felt. She moved through the courts of Vienna and German princely houses with grace and conviction, forming relationships grounded in mutual respect and intellectual parity. At a time when marriages were transactional, Adelheid embodied a different vision, one where companionship, dialogue, and shared purpose mattered. She spoke several languages fluently, read widely in philosophy and history, and engaged with ideas of governance and reform. Though she never sat beside Franz Joseph on a throne, her presence introduced the possibility of an empress who might have fostered cultural openness, intellectual exchange, and measured reform. In intimate conversations behind closed doors, she offered glimpses of another path, one where empathy guided rule as much as lineage, where a consort's judgment mattered alongside dynastic calculation. Her path also exposes the hidden levers of monarchical power. The court of Vienna functioned through networks of influence, patronage, and familial loyalty. Central to these was Archduchess Sophie, the mother of the emperor, whose resolve shaped one of the most important dynastic decisions of the era. Sophie's choice of Elizabeth over Adelheid was informed not by love, but by strategy. What knot of alliances, what balance of power, what cohesion of German Catholic ties could best serve the Habsburg state? Adelheid's intellectual independence and her connections to smaller German principalities made her appealing in private discourse, but at court she became a risk, a potential breach in the unified front Sophie sought to assemble. In deciding who would become empress, Sophie asserted that the invisible currents of influence, conversations in private parlors, subtle nudges to advisors, coded messages to diplomats, were more powerful than outward affection. Adelheid's story thus reveals that royal decisions were not made only on the basis of birth, beauty, or politics, but on the orchestration of hidden forces. From a forgotten history, Adelheid teaches that personal agency can exist even when structure seems immovable. Her life after being passed over for the imperial match offers powerful testimony to resilience and dignity. She married later into a ducal house with equanimity, served as duchess wisely, raised children who married into significant positions, and devoted herself to art, charity, and culture. She refused bitterness. Though denied the crown, she built a legacy of quiet influence and familial significance. Her situation shows that sacrifice need not mean surrender, and that agency can be exercised not only in public greatness, but in private virtue. She navigated grief and frustration with composure, choosing to define herself by actions and values rather than by title. Her decision not to chase scandal, not to fight for recognition or to linger in rumor, but instead to channel her energies into constructive purpose, exemplifies an inner strength rarely narrated in grand histories. The lessons of Adelheid's narrative extend beyond royalty. It reminds us that power is often invisible, negotiated behind palace walls, whispered in salons, and wielded through relationships rather than decrees. It shows how sacrifice can take many forms, choosing integrity over ambition, choosing intellectual companionship over convenience, preserving one's character when circumstances change irrevocably. And it illustrates agency in a world organized around hierarchy. When crown was denied, personal worth remained. These lessons resonate with anyone who has faced disappointment in the face of structural constraints, reminding us that dignity and resilience can outlast titles and publicity. But perhaps most compelling is why almost stories like Adelheid's continue to captivate. There is something deeply human about the unlived life, the path not taken, the love that was never sealed in ceremony. These are tales of possibility and fragility. We pause before them because they remind us that history is not just about what happened, but about what nearly happened. The court romances that never resulted in crowns or dynastic unions remain rich in alternative worlds. They invite speculation. What if that marriage had taken place? Would the empire have looked different? Would the subjects have seen their rulers differently? Such questions awaken our imagination, turning history into a stage for what might have been as much as what was. In Adelheid's case, there is a symmetry between her intellectual promise and the imaginative space she now occupies in history. She was never empress, yet she challenges us to think differently about empires, not just as machines of power, but as human institutions shaped by personality, emotion, and intellect. Her life invites us to consider the texture of royal politics beneath spectacle, to honor the lives lived in private virtue rather than public pageantry, to remember that the shadows in history often contain as much meaning as the grand monuments. This enduring fascination is also emotional. Readers and historians are drawn to the tenderness of unfulfilled bond, the tatters of ambition undone by politics, the dignity of a woman who met disappointment with poise. Adelheid's story is not one of bitterness or revenge. It is one of orchestration of fate by others and quiet mastery of one's own fate nonetheless. It resonates because it is both tragic and triumphant. The tragedy of lost possibility, the triumph of character unchanged. Moreover, in pop culture and historical reflection, these almost narratives allow for empathy without hero worship. We can admire Adelheid without needing her to attain ultimate status. We can feel regret for what she lost without condemning the sovereign who never loved her publicly. We can celebrate her later life without obliging her into historical martyrdom. There is space for vexed admiration, love for potential, for intelligence, for understated strength. The echoes of her story ripple through subsequent portrayals of royal figures, especially the way modern audiences reinterpret women at court. Not as static ornaments, but as actors constrained by systems, yet capable of subtle influence. Adelheid's narrative meshes with the appeal of hidden agency, the quiet soft power behind formal institutions, and the logic of moral authority over imposed authority. These are themes that echo in modern stories of women negotiating visibility, autonomy, and structural constraint. And so, as time unfolds, the story of Adelheid continues to be retold in scholarly articles, in historical novels, in media depictions of what-if courtships. People linger on the slender hope, the unfulfilled promise, and the grace with which it was carried. They sense in her a mirror of their own hopes and deferrals, for what we might have been, for opportunities that diagnostics withheld, for gifts unclaimed when circumstances denied their outward validation. In that mirror, Adelheid remains alive, not simply as a footnote in dynastic politics, but as an emblem of inner strength, of moral clarity when the court looked away, of value recognized not by coronation but by courage. Through decades, centuries even, her story reverberates. It speaks to a fascination with the backward glance, with the regal that might have been, with the integrity of a woman turned away, yet unbowed. And each retelling affirms that some legacies exist not in stones or titles, but in the quiet persistence of choice, in the enduring hum of what could have been, and in the strength of dignity kept even when exile from court becomes a new beginning. Adelheid's echo through time is subtle, intangible, yet resonant. It reminds us that history is shaped by those behind the throne as much as by those who occupy it. That power may be exercised in silence, sacrifice redeemed by action, an agency asserted even when the crown is absent. And that stories of almost love, almost reigns, almost alliances continue to fascinate because they leave space for imagination, empathy, and emotional truth in the gaps between what was commanded and what was lived.